Philosophical discussions of substance dualism almost invariably begin with Descartes and with the challenges and difficulties that arise from his version of mind-body dualism. In many ways, this is justified. Descartes was arguably the first to discern clearly the challenge to our understanding of the human person posed by the rise of mechanistic natural science. And his views set the stage for many of the subsequent debates on the topic. But there's another older tradition of substance dualism, one that still has numerous adherents, and that can be seen as offering correctives to some of Descartes' more questionable claims and emphases. I'm speaking of Thomas Aquinas' version of dualism, one which follows Aristotle in designating the human soul as the form of the human body. The present discussion will be directed at his version of dualism, and we'll also consider some other views that show some promise of overcoming objections to Aquinas' view. The Thomistic doctrine of the soul as the form of the body has all the right intentions. It aims to promote a close integration of soul and body, and more broadly of the human person with the overall world of nature. Yet it does this without denying or minimizing the distinctive attributes of human beings as rational, moral, and religious creatures. And while emphasizing that the normal and the best state for human beings is as embodied persons, it makes room for their persistence disembodied after biological death and their eventual re-embodiment in the resurrection. It's all the more regrettable then that the view as usually understood cannot accomplish these goals in a way that makes it a good candidate for our acceptance. At least that's what I'm going to argue. I'll then go on to consider a modification of the view that remedies the flaws noted in the standard version, but in the process becomes vulnerable to new and also formidable objections. Finally, I'll present an additional option, one that is slightly more distant from the Thomistic doctrine, but that shares enough of its assumptions and motivations to qualify as a worthy successor. I begin with a brief survey of Aquinas' view of the soul, following the exposition of that view by Eleanor Stump. The place to begin with is with Aquinas' notion of form, specifically with his notion of substantial form. According to Stump, a substantial form is the form in virtue of which a material composite is a member of the species to which it belongs, and it, that is the form, configures prime matter. Prime matter is the ultimate featureless stuff of which everything material is composed. Prime matter never occurs in its pure state. It always comes configured by a substantial form of some kind. All material things are composed of matter and form, and, quote, the complete form of the substantial and accidental forms taken together of a non-human material object is the arrangement or organization of the matter of that object in such a way that it constitutes that object rather than some other one, and gives that object its causal powers. An important point is expressed by that last clause, gives to the objects its causal powers. As we'll see, the causal powers given to living creatures, in particular to animals, by their forms are quite impressive. Also worthy of notice is specification to non-human material objects. Humans are indeed material objects, but the substantial form of a human being is a different sort than the form of other such objects. This contrast holds in particular between humans on the one hand and plants and animals on the other. Plants and animals have soul, the vegetative soul and the sensitive soul, but, quoting, unlike human souls, the souls of plants and non-human animals are nevertheless material forms. And even a material form that is a soul goes out of existence when the material composite it configures goes out of existence. Such a form is characterized by Stump as a configurational state of the matter which it informs. I think that's a fortunate description. Human souls, however, are another sort of thing. In addition to material forms, there are subsistent forms. These are immaterial rather than material. An angel, for example, is a subsistent immaterial form. Such subsistent forms can exist without there being any matter which they configure. According to Aquinas, if there is a subsistent form, it is immediately an entity and one. That is, it's a real thing in itself, not needing matter to enable it to exist. He also states, nothing keeps a form from existing without matter, even though matter cannot exist without a form. Now, it might occur to us at this point that employing the same term, form, to designate both these immaterial subsisting entities and the configurational states of material composites, Aquinas is equivocating on the word form. I'm inclined to think there's something in this criticism, but Stump explains the commonality of meaning by saying that for Aquinas, to be configured, to be is to be configured or to have a form, and everything, material or immaterial, is what it is in virtue of a form. Since this is so, Aquinas is perfectly content to deny matter of God, but he refuses to deny form of God. Being, even divine being, is configured. The human soul, however, is different from other subsistent immaterial forms, that is, from God and the angels, in that the human soul, unlike an angel, does configure matter. Aquinas puts it like this: the human soul has subsistent being insofar as its being does not depend on the body, but is rather elevated above corporeal matter. Nevertheless, the body receives a share in its being in such a way that there is one being of soul and body, and this is the being of a human. Stump sums up the situation by saying, so for Aquinas, the human soul is the noblest and highest of the forms that configure matter, but it's the lowest in the rank of intellectual and subsistent forms because it's mixed with matter, as the intellectual subsistent forms that are angels are not. It remains to say something about the way in which the material composite, which is a human being, begins and ends its earthly existence. Aquinas thinks that a human being is generated when the human soul replaces the merely animal soul of the fetus in the womb, and that a human being is corrupted or decomposed when the human soul leaves the body and is replaced by whatever other substantial form is in the dead corpse. Note that it's not a pre-existing human soul that replaces the animal soul in the fetus. Rather, the soul is created and infused in the same instant. The soul is created as the soul of this particular body. According to Aquinas, this occurs some 40 days after conception for a male and 80 days for a female. An interesting consequence of this is that an early stage fetus not only is not a human being, but will never become a human being. When one substantial form replaces another, a new substance comes into being. The commonality between the old substance and the new consists merely in the prime matter, which is the same in both. What we can say of the fetus, then, is that it consists in part of the prime matter that, if all goes well, will in time come to be the prime matter of a human being. There is much more in Aquinas' view that invites discussion, but the bare bones as set forth here should enable us to see how the view meets the desiderata listed at the beginning of the essay. By making the soul the form of the body, which structures the body and enables its distinctive powers and activities, the view points us to a closer and more profound integration of the two than is apparent either in the Platonic dualism, which Aquinas rejected, or in modern Cartesian dualism. At the same time, the distinctive nature of the human soul, as contrasted with the souls of animals, makes it plain that humans are not merely animals, rather they are rational animals, with all that implies. The fact that souls are subsistent, immaterial forms means that they are fully capable of continuing to exist after physical death, albeit in an imperfect state that looks forward to the resurrection. One might well ask, what is there in all this not to like? Unfortunately, the answer to that question is quite a bit. The problems I shall indicate become evident if the view is scrutinized in the light of certain developments in science and philosophy, developments which Aquinas could not have taken into account. I'll now argue that 1, this Thomistic view fails to convincingly integrate human beings with the rest of nature. 2, the work actually done by the human soul following Aquinas' theory is surprisingly limited. And 3, the case for including such souls in our system, as opposed to thinking of human beings as composed of matter and nothing else, or nothing but material forms, is comparatively weak. Here's the argument. I begin by pointing out that by making the human soul so fundamentally different from the souls of animals, the view already postulates a pretty wide gap between humans and the rest of animate creation, a gap which is papered over but not narrowed by the claim that each has a soul which is the form of its body. Beyond this, however, I've claimed that the work actually done by the human soul is surprisingly limited. In fact, I shall argue that this work amounts practically just to the difference made to human life by the fact that humans are rational creatures. That's no small matter, to be sure, but it falls short of the wide-ranging influence on human biology one would expect, given that the soul is said to be the substantial form of the body. To see why I say this, consider that by the time the soul is infused into the fetus, which may be a relatively late-stage fetus if we follow Aquinas, most of the essential biological structures are already in place, albeit in early stages of development. Consider also that very similar structures exist in the fetal development of an animal, say a gorilla or a chimpanzee, at a comparable stage. Now, the chimpanzee fetus, quite unaided by any subsisting immaterial form, will naturally develop into the magnificent animals we've recently learned so much about through Jane Goodall and others, for instance. This animal will function biologically in ways that are essentially similar to the functioning of a human being and will exhibit a rich and complex mental, emotional, and social existence, which, while lacking in some of the distinctive features of human life, nevertheless compels our admiration and wonder. Must we not suppose that the human fetus, if it were not infused with an immaterial soul, would be capable of the same sort of development? To this it will be replied that the sensitive soul, which is said to guide the development of the animal organism, does not continue in the human fetus, but is rather replaced by the subsisting human soul. And on account of this, it is indeed the immaterial human soul that guides and accounts for the development of the biological structures and functions of the mature organism. To which I reply, that's what the theory says, but this metaphysical fact, if it is a fact, seems to make no biological difference at all. According to the theory, the human being, which has an immaterial soul as its substantial form, is a new substance, different from the purely material substance of the fetus, which previously existed. Nothing carries over from the early fetus to the human being but prime matter. But a physician observing a fetus at the moment of infusion will not see its characteristic structures and processes suddenly disappear in order to reappear an instant later under the supervision of the subsistent soul. Biologically, everything carries on just as before. The only difference, even granting the theory, is that certain distinctively rational capacities will gradually become apparent, capacities which by hypothesis would not be present in the absence of an infused soul. It's very difficult to avoid the impression that the configurational state of the organism remains, whether or not it's still called the sensitive soul, and that it retains the causal efficacy which it had before the soul's infusion. And this, of course, leaves quite a lot less work to be done by the immaterial soul. This is what I meant by saying that, practically speaking, the difference made by the soul is limited to human rationality. The other criticism is that the case for the existence of subsistent souls is weak. The main philosophical reason given for their existence is that the activity of reason has no material organ. Unfortunately, this is one point at which it's very difficult for us to agree in the light of contemporary brain science. Stump, for one, simply admits that the traditional view is wrong about this. We should not, however, overlook the point that this is very nearly the only philosophical argument which is available for the immateriality of the soul. There will, of course, be the theological argument from an afterlife, but we would greatly prefer not to have a vitally important metaphysical position rest solely on such a theological argument. At least I would prefer that, okay? But why must this be so? Are there not other arguments which can be used and which are in fact used by dualists and others opposed to materialism? Indeed there are. There's the notorious hard problem of consciousness, the problem, if some have put it, of how soggy gray brain stuff gives rise to technicolor phenomenology. There's a problem of intentionality. How is it that a state of a physical system can mean something entirely different from itself, perhaps something that does not exist at all? There's a problem of teleology. How can matter behave in a way that is genuinely purposive, as opposed to merely giving the impression of purpose due to clever design, say like a thermostat? In particular, how can the course of our inquiries be oriented to the desire for truth rather than being guided merely by the mechanistic processes of our bodies and nervous systems? There is, one of my own favorites, the unity of consciousness argument. How can a mere collection of physical parts exhibit a unified consciousness, given that a complex physical conscious state cannot exist parceled out among the many pieces of a complex physical system? There are, to be sure, answers to these arguments by materialists, and the controversy rages on. But for the Thomistic dualist, there's a more fundamental problem, namely this. The Thomistic dualist cannot use any of these arguments because she's already conceded all of the points in dispute. She holds that animals, who by hypothesis have no subsistent souls, but only the appropriate configuration of the material organism, exhibit all the phenomena in question: sensory experience, pleasure and pain, intentionality. Who that is loved and been loved by a dog can doubt that a dog has ideas of particular individuals, purposefulness, and unified states of consciousness. For her, none of these phenomena gives any purchase for an argument to the existence of an immaterial soul. And other arguments that will serve that purpose for her may be hard to come by. Next, we examine a version of dualism developed by J.P. Moreland. Actually, Moreland's dualism comes in two versions, corresponding to the two traditional Christian ideas about the origin of the soul: creationism and traducianism. Creationism is by far the majority Christian view. It holds that each human soul is directly and individually created by God, whereas traducianism holds that human souls are in some way derived from the parents through the natural process of reproduction. We consider here Moreland's creationist version. Moreland terms his view Thomistic substance dualism, though he acknowledges that he deviates at some points from Aquinas' view. For our purposes, three of these deviations are especially important, since they provide the key to alleviating the difficulties noted above for the original version. They are as follows. 1, the possession of immaterial subsistent souls is not limited to human beings, but rather is common to all animals, indeed to all living things. 2, the infusion of souls occurs not at a later stage in the development of the organism, as it does for Aquinas, but rather at the very beginning for humans at the time of conception. 3, the infused soul is unambiguously involved in and necessary for both the development of the essential biological organs and their successful functioning. It's this third point that I take to be most central because it enables Moreland to make good on the full integration of soul and body that was aimed at, but not convincingly achieved in Aquinas' original version. Here are some quotations which illustrate the nature and intimacy of the relation as Moreland conceives of it. The soul is a substance with an essence or inner nature which contains as a primitive unity a complicated structural arrangement of capacities and dispositions for developing a body. Taken collectively, this entire ordered structure can be called the substance's principle of activity, and will be that which governs the precise ordered sequence of changes that the substance will go through in the process of growth and development. The various physical and chemical parts and processes, including DNA, are tools, instrumental causes employed by higher order biological activities in order to sustain the various functions grounded in the soul. Thus, the soul is the first efficient cause of the body's development, as well as the final cause of its functions and structure internally related to the soul's essence. The functional demand of the soul's essence determine the character of the tools, but they in turn constrain and direct the various chemical and physical processes that take place in the body. Moreland sums up his view of the human organism in a series of points. The organism as a whole, the soul, is ontologically prior to its parts. The parts of the organism's body stand in internal relations to other parts and to the soul's essence. They are literally functional entities. The heart functions literally to pump blood. The operational functions of the body are rooted in the internal structure of the soul. The body is developed and grows in a teleological way as a series of developmental events that occur in a law-like way, rooted in the internal essence of the human soul. The efficient cause of the characteristics of the human body is the soul. The various body parts, including DNA genes, are important instrumental causes the soul uses to produce the traits that arise. This material elaborates a third of the points noted above, in which Moreland deviates from Aquinas' original version of Thomistic dualism. The other 2 points it will be seen are natural complements of the third. If it's the soul that guides and directs the development of the organism throughout, then it's appropriate and perhaps inevitable that this will begin to occur coinciding with the beginning of the organism's existence, rather than at some later time. The similarity in the biological growth and development between humans and other animals and plants argues strongly for a similarity in their basic causes. Thus, the attribution of immaterial subsistent souls to plants and animals as well as to humans. This does not mean, of course, that animal souls, let alone those of plants, are similar in all respects to those of humans. We can gain some grasp of the differences by observing the differences in the capacities typically exercised by well-developed adult members of the various species. Nevertheless, the souls of animals and plants belong to the same metaphysical category as the souls of human beings. This seems to be inherently plausible and also does much to bridge the ontological gulf between humans and other living creatures that, in spite of all good intentions, still remains for Aquinas' version of dualism. Even this brief summary, I believe, is sufficient to indicate that Moreland's view of the soul-body relationship is well developed and deeply considered. It's a view that demands in turn our serious consideration. The view clearly overcomes all 3 of the objections urged against the original version of Thomistic dualism. In the light of the quotations above, the close integration of soul and body requires no further comment. But the view also makes it possible, as Thomas's own view does not, for its advocate to utilize the full battery of arguments critical of materialism and in favor of dualism. This is because Moreland, unlike Thomas, does not at the outset concede to the materialist the phenomena that are the basis for those arguments. Since the active involvement of the soul is said to be essential from the very beginning of the organism's life and development, and for animals as well as for human beings, Moreland has no need and no inclination to conceive that such phenomena as qualia, intentionality, purpose, and unified consciousness can be adequately explained by structures and processes that are wholly material. Admittedly, arguments based on these phenomena can and will be resisted by materialists, and this debate shows no sign of ending in the foreseeable future. But a dualist who has access to these arguments has available formidable dialectical resources for advocating and defending her view, something which, as we have seen, is not the case for the traditional Thomistic dualism. Now the downside. There are, however, at least two major areas in which Moreland's version of dualism encounters new problems of its own, problems that were not an issue for Aquinas' view. First of all, it's abundantly clear from the material quoted above that the view is committed to, excuse me, I have pages stick together, to vitalism, which holds, definition, first, that in every living organism there is an entity that is not exhaustively composed of inanimate parts, and second, that the activities characteristic of living organisms are due, in some sense, to the activities of this entity. Now, it's an undisputed fact that vitalism has had an extended history in the biological sciences and has been advocated by many prominent biologists. It's also a fact, however, that the view has lost credibility for almost all biologists for about a century. It's now universally regarded as a failed research program that has been abandoned for good reason. The association of Moreland's version of dualism with this failed research program is not, to put it gently, a point in its favor. Moreland is aware of this complaint and devotes some effort to defending his view against it. In brief, his answer is that the cruder forms of vitalism in the past were rightly rejected because they make unjustified assumptions concerning the individual essence, assumptions which his view has no need to accept. He goes on to say that a more adequate vitalism, if we wish to use this term of the Thomistic substance view, and we prefer the term organicism, grounds the doctrine of substance in factors like an irreducible, organic, holistic relation among parts to parts and parts to whole, the species-specific immanent laws of organization and development, and the internal structural form and normal functioning found in living things. The features to which Moreland appeals here can be grouped under the general label of anti-reductionism, and he clearly believes that biological research gives some support to such claims, even though, as I trust he would admit, the specific claim about the entity that is not exhaustively composed of inanimate parts, whose activities are responsible for the activities characteristic of living organisms, this is generally rejected by biologists. That is, they may accept anti-reductionism, but they don't accept this immaterial substance. Perhaps he hopes that this more specific claim will eventually be supported by a vitalist research program that's better conceived than those that have been abandoned. Or he may consider that the more specific claim is not one that can be expected to have observable biological consequences, and thus is outside the scope of a legitimate biological research program. Either way, he seeks to insulate his view from the failure that such endeavors have met with in the past. Whether this is a promising and attractive line to take, I have to leave it to you to decide. The other major difficulty for Moreland's version of Thomistic dualism is found in the theory of biological evolution. It's quite difficult to see how his theory can be reconciled with any plausible version of evolutionary theory. The options are narrowed considerably when Moreland states, quote, "For the Thomist, a genus and species in the category of substance are not degreed properties. That is, either they are fully predicable of an entity or they are absence. An entity either is or is not a human person or some other type of person." This is admirably clear and definite, and it rules out immediately the widely held notion that in a broad evolutionary perspective, biological classifications such as genus and species are blurred and mutable. To be sure, it need not be the case that species, in Moreland's metaphysical sense, maps directly onto the biological concept of species, a concept which is itself very much in dispute. But in view of the detailed way in which the soul directs and energizes the development of the organism, the kinds of souls must themselves be very numerous. Kinds of organisms that are different in any major or substantive way will need to have different kinds of souls overseeing their growth and functioning. These species of souls, furthermore, are immutable and immutably distinct. Nor is it at all plausible in the light of this view that God first waits until a suitably advanced organism is evolved and then supplies a new soul with enhanced capabilities to animate it. For one thing, this would contradict the fundamental assumption that the organism as a whole, that is the soul, is ontologically prior to its parts such as DNA, for example. Nor would such a view make sense biologically. Absent the right sort of soul, the DNA that codes for evolutionary advance would be non-functional and would not be preserved by evolutionary selection. So far as I can see, the only variety of evolution compatible with Moreland's view would be one in which God simultaneously brings about the desired change in the mechanisms of heredity, DNA and so on, and also produces a new kind of soul with the capability to develop and energize the new higher organism. But this, of course, would not by any means be evolution as a natural process, and we can confidently predict that it would be rejected by evolutionary biologists, theists and non-theists alike. The more likely position for one who accepts this variety of dualism is the theory of progressive creation, according to which God from time to time creates ex nihilo new kinds of organisms as the surrounding environment has become ready to accept and support them. Moreland himself probably would not see this as a defect of his view, since he may already be inclined for other reason to accept both progressive creationism and the intelligent design theory, which provides support for creationism. For those of us, on the other hand, who regard such a process as unpromising, the evolutionary objection forms a formidable barrier to acceptance of his creationalist version of dualism. At this point, I must acknowledge that the objections I've raised against both Aquinas' original version of dualism and Moreland's adaptation of it are not likely to prove compelling to everyone. I hope, however, that I've done enough to motivate us to consider an additional view on the soul-body relation, a view that has enough in common with the Thomistic doctrine that it can be recognized as a kindred attempt to reach some of the same objectives. To this alternative we now turn. And this, surprise, is emergent dualism, okay? The final view to be considered does not grow out of the Thomistic tradition, but it can be viewed as standing a certain dialectical relation to the views already surveyed. The original Thomistic view establishes a kind of balance between the capabilities attributable to matter, that is, material stuff plus the material forms, including the vegetative and sensitive soul, and those attributed to immaterial, divinely created souls. Matter in the material forms suffice for all subhuman life forms and for the earlier stages of human developments, whereas immaterial, subsistent souls are required for human rationality and everything that goes with it. I've argued that this balance tends to be unstable and that the Thomist has few resources with which to oppose the counterclaim that the inherent powers of matter in the material forms suffice for human life as well. Moreland's version of Thomistic dualism tilts the balance decisively in favor of the divinely created souls. Such souls are essential for both the development and the functioning of the organism at all stages of its life. The genetic and other materials present at the beginning of life have the status merely of tools, instrumental causes employed by higher order biological activities in order to sustain the various functions grounded in the soul. But they are incapable of creating and sustaining life on their own, absent the active powers of the soul. Even a blade of grass needs a soul to enable it to function. Arguably, such a view is more coherent internally than the original Thomistic version, but as we've seen, it runs afoul of conclusions that are widely held to have been established by the biological sciences, evolution and so on. The view now to be considered tilts the balance in the opposite direction, in favor of powers held to be inherent in the nature of matter itself. It amounts then to embracing the alternative that was seen to be threatening to the original Thomistic doctrine, view that the powers inherent in matter are sufficient for humans in all of its aspects, human life in all of its aspects. The human soul, we shall say, is a new substance which emerges from the living, functioning human body, in particular from the human brain and nervous system. The view, in other words, is one of emergent dualism. I might say this is similar in many ways to Tim O'Connor's view, which he presented, only on this view, there is a new substance, a new thing, a new entity, the soul. That doesn't happen according to O'Connor. This sort of view immediately raises a host of questions, only a few of which can be addressed in the space available here. One point to notice is that while the Thomist view of the soul is not generally thought of as emergentist, the notion of emergence is not really foreign, either to Aquinas or to Moreland. According to Stump, mental properties are emergent on Aquinas' view, insofar as they are features which are dependent on the configuration and composition of the whole. Moreland goes even further when setting out the Traducian variant of his theory, and this is the one he really believes. He states that, quote, the union of sperm and egg amounts to a form of substantial change in which two different entities come together, and this gives rise to the emergence of a new substantial whole, a soul. Moreland's view on this Traducian interpretation is itself a version of emergent dualism. So welcome to the club, JP. There are certain differences between the emergent dualism proposed here and Moreland's version, but we won't take time to discuss those differences now. Perhaps the most important questions that need to be addressed revolve around the worry that if we adopt this view, we shall be conceding too much to the materialists and will be unable to maintain the distinctive character and dignity of human persons, to say nothing of their destiny and an afterlife. I don't believe this worry is justified. It's true that emergent dualism attributes some rather remarkable powers to ordinary matter, though not a great deal more than is the case on Stump's version of Aquinas, and arguably less than with Moreland's Traducian variation. There are, however, a number of arguments available to us that show the inadequacy of the currently popular forms of materialism. I've mentioned these, and I won't go over them again, except I want to say a little bit about the unity of consciousness argument, which is what, on my view, forces us to affirm an immaterial substance. Here the question is, when we're aware of a complex state of consciousness, what is it that experiences this awareness? It's out of the question that a complex state of consciousness should in its totality be experienced by, say, a single neuron, let alone by a single atom or a single elementary particle. But here's the key insight. A complex state of consciousness cannot exist divided among the parts of a complex physical object. Even if each bit of the conscious state were encoded in, say, a single neuron, that would still leave unanswered the question, what is it that is aware of the conscious state as a whole? And the answer to this, I maintain, must be found in the emergent soul. As Leibniz said long ago, it's in the simple substance and not in the composite or in the machine that one must look for perception. It should be evident, however, that a full appreciation of this or any of the other arguments would require a much fuller discussion than I can give here. Finally, what of the life to come? If the mind or soul is a distinct substance and not merely an aspect of the physical organism, then it's at least logically possible for it to exist apart from the organism after the latter has decayed in death. On the other hand, if the organism and the self are the same thing, it looks like when you die, you're gone. That's the problem that Tim was wrestling with yesterday. To be sure, the soul is initially generated from that very same organism and its ordinary functioning sustained by it. But it's open to us to suppose that once generated, the soul acquires the capability to exist on its own after the death of the body. Or if not that, then that it can be sustained in existence by God in the absence of its ordinary bodily support. Actually, some supposition like that is needed by any view that extends the possession of souls even to animals in general. That is, that the soul can be sustained by God absent the body, assuming that we don't wish to hold that all animals are naturally immortal. By way of summary, the hypothesis of emergent dualism accomplishes all of the desiderata for a mind-body theory set out at the beginning of this lecture. It portrays a close integration between soul and body, and between the human person and the rest of nature. It also enables us to honor the distinctive excellences of human beings and to affirm their existence in an afterlife, after biological death. Arguably, it's more successful in the task of integration than is the original Thomistic dualism. Since it does not postulate a soul which is immediately created by God, it has no need to defend such a view. Furthermore, it's well placed to use any or all of a battery of arguments directed against the currently fashionable varieties of materialism. Unlike Moreland's version of Thomistic dualism, it's not committed to any form of vitalism, nor is it obliged to defend the absolute fixity of species, whether they be species of biological organisms or of souls. Without doubt, there's much more that can be said for and against such a view, but my time is gone, so I have to leave that for later discussion. Thank you.
The last time Bill and I were paired together was, I don't know if you remember this, about 30 years ago. And you gave a paper on agent causation, and I, not being a fan of agent causation, it sparked some real, I remember I think it was Richard Purtill had stood up and said, maybe I can find some peace between you guys, and but it won't be that way today, Bill. Professor Hasker begins by focusing on the standard Thomistic doctrine of the soul. I'm largely sympathetic with his assessment of standard Thomism. For example, if the human soul is the form of the body, the work that it does seems, as Hasker points out, surprisingly limited. By the time the human soul is infused into the fetus, most of the essential biological structures are in place, though developed to a limited degree, as Bill points out. And the fetus of an animal, like a chimpanzee, which will never be informed by a rational immaterial soul, will develop into an adult with a psychological life that includes pains, pleasures, and perhaps some degree of emotion. But if a material form can give rise to this kind of psychological life, the subject of psychological properties need not be something immaterial. Some kind of dual aspect theory seems to capture adequately what goes on in the psychology of beasts. So the only thing for which an immaterial soul is needed on the standard Thomistic view is reasoning. If I read Hasker correctly, he thinks standard Thomism about the soul leaves us with little or no reason in the existence to believe in the existence of the immaterial soul. After all, if experiences are of pain and pleasure, intentionality, purposeful action, and the unity of consciousness can all be had by non-human animals that are infused with immaterial forms, what grounds is left for believing in the immaterial soul? He turns to the thought of Professor Moreland, who advocates a non-standard form of Thomistic dualism. I'm going to try and link these because JP's up next. Moreland's non-standard Thomistic dualism is fundamentally motivated by Cartesian intuitions. I've been here for 4 months. Practically every time I came into Biola, I was picked up by J.P. Moreland, and the first thing he'd ever say to me when I get into the car was, "Welcome to paradise, Goetz." I'm from Pennsylvania, and this, but I got a little give and take with him on his Thomistic form of dualism, which I find interesting, is actually grounded in Cartesian intuitions. And I'll just read some of these to you. I just picked 5. Here's what Moreland thinks are the justifications for believing in the soul. 1, I have the deep intuition that I cannot exist in degrees. If I lose, say, half of my body or brain, I do not become half of a person. I am an all or nothing kind of being. I'm either there or not there. 2, I have the deep intuition that my consciousness is unified at a moment of time. At any given time, my mental states, my thoughts and sensations, are all seamlessly united in a single stream of consciousness that is mine. And I have no difficulty in identifying which mental states are mine. 3, I have the deep intuition that my consciousness is unified across time. As I move from one room of my home to another, I seem to be the same person that lives through and owns each successive experience of my home. 4, I have strong intuitions that psychological criteria of personal identity in terms of memories, character, and personality traits are neither necessary nor sufficient for my continued identity through change. Thus, I could remain the same person where I'd undergo a change in personality and lose some or all of my memories. And just because the personality and memories that I have never change does not guarantee that I remain as the same person. Another person might have the same personality and memories, and that person not be me. 5, I have strong intuitions that I and my body have different persistence conditions. Conditions that, if fulfilled, entail that the same entity continues to exist. For example, I could continue to exist as the same person with less than a fully intact body. I could lose an arm or a leg, or a different body, or no body at all. Now, according to Moreland, the best explanation of 1 through 5, these different things that drive him, Cartesian intuitions, is that I am directly aware of myself as a simple, non-extended, indivisible spiritual substance. Because I'm directly aware of myself as such a substance, I have the intuitions described in 1 through 5. In short, the intuitions captured in 1 through 5, I quote JP here, are easily unified if they're grounded in a direct awareness of the self as a simple spiritual substance. And they are hard to unify and justify otherwise. End of quote. Now, as Hasker states, Moreland's view of the soul is Thomistic insofar as it asserts that the soul is involved in and necessary for both the developments of bodily organs and their successful functioning. By contrast, Descartes believed that the soul did not give life to and facilitate the development of the body. In conversation, in the car coming in the morning, I have asked Moreland if he's aware, from the first person perspective, of informing and giving life to his body. And he has denied that he is. However, he has told me that in addition to the 5 Cartesian considerations that I've already mentioned, plus a couple of others he has, he's also aware from the first person perspective of being spatially present in the entirety at the points in space occupied by his physical body. In other words, if you were all to sit there right now, sitting there, you could feel yourselves like you feel like you're present in your hands, in your feet, in your head. And Moreland cites this as a first-person datum. Descartes, as traditionally understood, denies this kind of spatial location to the soul that was affirmed by Aquinas and by Moreland. Hasker says that Thomism has all the right intentions when it aims to promote a close integration between soul and body by making the soul the form of and giver of life to the body. However, what is an adequate account of the integration of the soul and the body? Moreland's told me, again in conversation, that he would still be a soul-body dualist and believe the soul is closely enough integrated with its body, even if he were to become convinced that the soul, while causally interacting with and occupying the same space as its physical body, did not inform it or give it life. So he would still be a dualist. Presumably, he would consider this an adequate account of the integration of the soul and the body. But if that's the case, what is sufficient for being an adequate account of the integration between the soul and body? As a substance dualist myself, I'll be honest, I'm not sure how to answer that question. I lean toward what I think of as a kind of C.S. Lewis mere dualist position. You take Lewis's Mere Christianity, translate it over, and you get mere dualism. I'm committed, like Moreland and Hasker, to affirming what I know about myself from the first-person perspective. Here I include that I am a substantively simple entity. I have no substantive parts, with various psychological powers and capacities, and that I regard a certain physical thing as my body because, one, I seem to fill it. I'm with Moreland on this. I do seem to fill the space occupied by my physical body. Two, when certain things are done to it, I experience, say, pleasure and pain. And three, when I intend and choose for purposes to act and move, it moves. And the idea here is precisely what Professor Swinburne was referring to yesterday. When we intend to do certain things, our bodies move. And Jeffrey Schwartz, when we kind of refocus our attention, we're affecting our brain. So I think we have this, we regard this body as, I would regard it as mine because I can actively impact it. Perhaps I give life to my body, perhaps I don't. While I believe I causally interact with my body, I wouldn't be uncomfortable with admitting that I don't. Perhaps occasionalism is true. For those of you not familiar with these philosophical crazy distinctions, some might think, on an occasionalist view, every time I intend that my body move in a certain way, God causes it to move. I don't. And so on every occasion that I attend, God will produce the motion. Perhaps Leibnizian pre-established harmony is true. Whichever of these positions is correct, I consider what I have just said about what I am aware of from the first-person perspective to provide an adequate account of my integration with my body. But maybe I'm wrong about that. What now about the coming into existence of the soul? Hasker advocates an emergent dualism, which says roughly that when the human brain and nervous system reaches a sufficient degree of complexity, a new substance, soul, emerges ex nihilo. The more traditional Christian theistic view, which I'll just refer to as the traditionalist account, is that God directly creates the soul ex nihilo. Is either of these views preferable to the other? Because according to it, the soul is more closely integrated with its body. Again, I'm not sure how to answer that question. But once again, I lean toward a mere dualism. I believe that I am a metaphysically contingent soul and ultimately depend for my existence at every moment that I do exist on the creative, preservative power of God. While I believe that God directly created me, my soul, ex nihilo, so I'm a traditionalist. I right now believe that God created me as a soul and continues directly to preserve me in existence, largely for the reason that Hasker cites, which is that the power to bring something into existence ex nihilo is a remarkable power. So that with Bill's view, I'm always just a little uneasy. Bringing something into existence ex nihilo just seems to me to be absolutely a remarkable power. And to think that something material has it, I don't know, just not the best fit. But again, if I were to learn or become convinced that God did not create my soul ex nihilo, but rather I was brought into existence by some complex arrangement of material parts, I would be okay with that. Given that Hasker believes creation ex nihilo excuse me, is a remarkable power, why does he believe God has bestowed it on matter? In his book, The Emergent Self, Hasker says the following. I'm going to give a lengthy quote here from Hasker. If we persist in supposing that at least some animals enjoy mental lives, we have to suppose them endowed with souls. That at least some animal, we have to suppose them endowed with souls in the same sense in which humans are so endowed. And this in turn leads into a whole tangle of intriguing questions. The doctrine of the special creation of individual souls will then have to be extended from the human case to all other ensouled creatures. This may not seem terribly problematic as applied to dolphins and horses, but it boggles the mind when we come to slugs, termites, and mosquitoes. Excuse me, it does seem that some response is due from dualists on these issues. Still more difficult, however, is the problem that arises with cloning or with other situations in which an animal is physically divided into parts, with each part subsequently developing into a complete organism. Prior to the division, there's one animal and one soul. Afterwards, there are two animals and two souls. But where does the additional soul come from? Are we to suppose that God is, so to speak, on call to provide an additional soul whenever one is required? And finally, there's the difficulty that there does not seem to be any plausible or natural way to incorporate Cartesian souls into the process of biological evolution. Should we suppose that once an organism has physically evolved, God creates for it an appropriately different kind of soul than that which animated its forebears? That's Hasker. Now here's Hasker's own view. This theory, emergent dualism, I'm quoting him here, is completely free of embarrassment over the souls of animals. Animals have souls just as we do. Their souls are less complex and sophisticated than ours because generated by less complex nervous systems. End quote. On Hasker's view then, matter was created by God so that when it evolved to a certain level of complexity, it had the power to create souls ex nihilo. Moreover, God created matter so that when it reached other developmental milestones of less complexity, it had the power to create beastly souls of different kinds, dolphins, horses, etc., ex nihilo. But won't Hasker have to face the question of where in the evolutionary process an arrangement of matter first reached a level of complexity sufficient for the remarkable power of creating souls of some kind ex nihilo? In his words, quote, "It boggles the mind when we come to slugs, termites, and mosquitoes. It does seem that some response is due from traditional dualists, like me, on these issues," end quote. Does Hasker owe us a response? And it seems to me he does if the traditional dualist owes a response on this. My point's as follows. There are intrusions into the evolutionary story, both in an account where God directly creates souls of different kinds ex nihilo, and on an account where he does so indirectly by endowing matter with this remarkable power. It's hard for me to see, at least, how one account has a leg up on the other with respect to the evolutionary story. Perhaps the preference for one account over the other is a matter of personal taste. Hasker sees the traditional account as requiring God to get his hands dirty too often. The traditionalist sees Hasker's account as incorporating a view of God as a kind of distant figure. At Dean Zimmerman's talk last night, I thought it was interesting. Dean painted this picture of, I think the word he used was neater. The emergentist view is just a neater picture. And then Jeffrey Schwartz, I believe, if I understood this right, shot back, well, I think my picture's neater. And then I think you said it was a value judgment at that point. Here, I want to stress once again, I'm going to close here, by saying that I'm inclined to invoke mere dualism and say I'm committed to affirming that I and other souls are metaphysically contingent and ultimately dependent for their existence at every moment, like myself, on the creative preservative power of God. While I'm inclined toward the traditional view of the soul's origin, I can intellectually live with Hasker's account, should in the end be convinced of it. But unless there's some way to draw up widely accepted, necessary, and sufficient conditions for what accounts as a close integration of soul and body, all of these seem to me to be matters of this family dispute. And there we go.
Well, strange as it might seem, we're running precisely on schedule. And that means we'll have a panel discussion after our second session where we'll have an opportunity for some more dialogue between Professor Goetz and Professor Hasker. But we have now 10, 15 minutes or so for some Q&A directed for Professor Hasker. So can I ask you to come up again and field some questions? Fantastic. So we've got about 10 minutes or so for some Q&A.
I thought he was going to let you go, but he didn't let any of us go. See a hand here? Are you going to? Okay, yeah. So.
Professor Hasker, I'm at a disadvantage because I don't have your paper in front of me, so I have to depend upon what I heard.
Yes.
So you'll forgive me if I misheard your paper. But I think some of your critique of Thomas Aquinas is inapposite in this sense. For instance, when you talk about the fetus and the development of the fetus before, what was it, the 40 days?
Infusion of the soul, yeah.
That seems to me, what you're doing there is you're critiquing the Thomistic theory as if it were an empirical theory, and you're showing it's disconfirmed. And that's one thing. I mean, and to treat Thomism as a kind of a scientific theory and saying, well, it's disconfirmed, we now know that that isn't the case. That is not a philosophical critique, right? I mean, you'd have to work within the assumptions of St. Thomas in order to actually give a philosophical critique of St. Thomas. But what you've done there is an inapposite critique of saying, well, it's a disconfirmed empirical theory, but that doesn't really affect some of the ideas of what St. Thomas is actually saying from a philosophical perspective. And then, well, I have a number of.
Well, let me respond to that. First of all, I fully admit that Thomas's theory is consistent with philosophically, it's consistent with the view that the skull is infused at the moment of conception, and but I mean, this is what he says, so I'm commenting on his theory. And I don't see that it's inapposite in the sense that I'm asking whether Thomas's theory is one that we can and should accept today. Now, if we make that modification, most of my criticism still remains. So that isn't, although I think it's kind of interesting that his view has those weird consequences, that's not the central part of my critique.
And then with respect to the angels, the discussion of the subsistent forms, I think with respect to angelic forms, I think we need to discuss the distinction between essence and existence that Thomas had, because he believes that these forms can exist disembodied because God is the ultimate ground of being,
sure.
And therefore he provides the being for these disembodied forms. So this is how.
Well, I didn't comment on any way on that topic, so I don't see how it's relevant to my paper. Yeah, okay. I mean, it's fair. What you say is true, of course, but I don't see how it's a comment on my paper.
Thank you, Dr. Hasker. Great instruction there. I had a question at the end of your discussion. You were critiquing Moreland's view of traducianism. And your critique, as I understood, again, these are my hand notes, so you can correct me, is you were saying he's really welcome as an emergent dualism.
Well, he is an emergent dualist.
Okay,
there's no doubt. It's not a critique. It's
That's not my question.
Okay.
I just want to. Okay.
Yeah.
So welcome. You're emergent dualist, And, but your criticism of that view of traducianism as an emergent dualism is that you believe this view gives too much power to emergence. Then, right after that, you go to your explanation at the end.
No, I'm sorry. Emergent dualism is my view.
No,
I mean,
okay,
okay.
let me just try to get the question out, and then you can see if I got it clear.
Okay, sorry.
Okay? The idea is that, you're critiquing traducianism's, Moreland's view of emergent dualism, okay? Maybe I can get it out, and then you can correct me, okay?
Sorry.
Emergent dualism, and you just made the comment, I've written down actually your words, that you said believes that you believe this view just gives, your uncomfortableness with traducianism, Moreland's view is that it gives too much power to emergence there. And then you go at the end and you say, my view of emergent dualism, of course, has to explain also life after death. So at the end of life, then there's an emergence that comes about. And I guess my question is, why is Moreland wrong to assert that at the beginning of life, and you're right to assert it at the end of life?
I guess I have trouble with all this. I do not critique the criticisms of Moreland or the criticisms of the creationist version. Now, I do have some differences with Moreland on his traducian version, but I didn't go into those at all. So I wasn't critiquing that in any way. So I just, again, it doesn't seem, I don't see how this registers on my view. I mean, I know I presented my view very briefly at the end, so it's understandable that it wasn't fully clear, and I'm sorry for that.
Hello, Dr. Hasker. I remember a while ago I read about an experiment that was very, very interesting, where they'd taken a circuit board and then made random variations of the circuit board and then tested them to see if they could actually determine between the words yes or no. And of these circuit boards, they threw into the crusher all the ones that didn't end up even registering anything. And then over generations, they ended up with a circuit board that could actually distinguish between the word yes and no and actually put out a single signal that indicated that it perceived that. Okay, so here you have a device that basically evolved to perceive. And you see exactly the same thing in nature, where you see, predators actually focusing in on the color red because it happens to correspond with hemoglobin. Okay, so these things actually evolve to perceive and survive. Now, when you have a body that perceives, isn't it kind of redundant to also have a soul that perceives? And instead, maybe you have a soul that hijacks a perceiving body. So I'm just basically saying we're probably not going to be doing calculus in heaven.
Yeah, well, in order to answer that, I would have to go into the arguments that are critical of materials, which I did not have a chance to develop. I mean, I just couldn't develop those in the paper. However, I will, reference again the unity of consciousness argument. When I have a conscious experience, what is it that has that experience? And I maintain the experience can't be divided up among many different parts or elements in my body. But again, to answer that in full would be several more other lectures, I think, honestly. So, excuse me, but I have to say read my book. Okay.
I'm a little bit skeptical of your reasons for rejecting vitalism, just because scientists, or something like vitalists, just because scientists no longer hold it doesn't mean it was ever refuted. And I think of somebody like Rupert Sheldrake. When you look at the issues of morphogenesis, like how the cells know how to differentiate into the right patterns, first of all, there seems to be way more information in the three-dimensional structure of the body than contained in the DNA. That's one problem, and it's very difficult to see how chemical gradients or anything like that could do the job. So Sheldrake, and he's probably the most one that pushes this line the most, but other people dealing with morphogenesis have similar problems. he pushes the line that there's some kind of morphic field, there's some invisible field that directs it. Now that is sounding to me similar, at least, to JP's idea of the soul. So I would be, and one more analogy I'd make there, that it'd be like somebody saying rejecting dualism, because most neuroscientists, if you took a poll of most neuroscientists, probably 99% would not be dualist. But we wouldn't think that was necessarily a good reason for rejecting dualism.
Well, of course, philosophers disagree about everything, as you know, whereas among scientists, we hope for some sort of consensus. But really, I take your point seriously, and it may be that what you've indicated is, you might say, the germ or the beginning of a research program that will reinvigorate vitalism. So I don't, in principle, I don't have any objection to what you're saying. I think empirically, it's the fact that the view was held tenaciously for quite a long period of time, and then has been abandoned because apparently it didn't provide illumination in biological research. But it could be revived. That's certainly possible.